Thank you.
Yeah, that's.
Okay. Thank you again for the interest in the Great Decisions program. That I've lost track of the exact starting date, but this is about the 40th year that First Church has sponsored a Great Decisions program. The program itself is about 60 years old. That the Foreign Policy Association prepares nonpartisan materials in a workbook, which is available, that the instructions for signing up for the notification of tell you how
Now, registered ahead of time, we'll send you,
that
I'll forward that to you.
there are two copies of the workbook in the church library. If people wish to read what I or any of the other speakers have read how the authors of those pieces have treated the subjects that our speakers will. That we structure it here in a way that is only loosely keyed to the Great Decisions workbook. We use all of the same topics that they do. It's set up as a public education. Ordinary people who don't specialize in the subjects can lead the discussions. Here, in part because of the talent available in the Stanford area and because I know a lot of people. What we've done is each year, including this year, identify people who are expert on the subject, available to talk to us, but not tie them too closely to the chapters in the workbook. So if you've read this week's reading or as you read others, don't be surprised if there is a divergence. The important thing is these are difficult and important subjects that can be approached in many ways. That I realize that even though I've been around a long time, in some respects have become out of touch with that. Every year I know most of the authors of the workbook chapters, and that's true of this year as well. 5 of the 8 I have worked with at some point in my career. A pitch for the subsequent sessions that the speakers are very good. They're very good on their topics. So if you can come in person, that's great. If you watch on Zoom, that's also great. And if you miss one, they will be recorded and available usually a day or two after they are presented on the First Church website. So let me, with that, transition into tonight's topic by introducing myself. In subsequent sessions, I will introduce the speaker. For those who don't know me, my name is Tom Finger. I am at Stanford in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. This is my 3rd go round at Stanford. I was there as a graduate student. I was there for 11 years in the 1970s into the 1980s. I see Ron Herring, who knew me back then. And then I left for Washington for 2 years that stretched into 23. And I've been back 16. So I now have just about equal time teaching at Stanford, 26 years, and in the US government, also 26 years. So I approach this topic and others as, in part, a scholar, an academic, a political scientist who looks at the subject matter as an object of study, but also as a practitioner, an operator, somebody who has lived many of these issues. Tonight's subject, which was picked probably 15 months ago by the Foreign Policy Association when they commissioned John Eikenberry, who is a professor at Princeton, to write this piece. The idea that U.S. foreign policy would be an important issue this year was a pretty safe bet. How it would become important, or what dimensions of the policy are at a turning point or a crossroads, to use Eikenberry's terminology, could not have been known at the time. And in some respects, foreign policy at a crossroads is now 40 years old. We've been at a crossroads in many respects since the end of the Cold War. That the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991. And we entered a period that we called, not very creatively, the post-Cold War era. And part of the reason for that was that nobody in the United States, in academia, in government, in other parts of the world, came up with a descriptive characterization of the period that would also be the basis for strategies for managing a set of relationships, a set of international challenges and issues that were no longer those of the bipolar existential struggle between the United States and the West and the Soviet Union and its world. That George H.W. Bush, who was president at the time that the Cold War ended, in a formal sense, tried to develop what he called a new world order, which looked a lot like the Cold War, only we and Moscow were now going to be holding hands, walking to the future, bringing along our respective partners and alliances. And instead of fighting one another, we work together. And that approach worked a little bit for a few months in the Madrid conference on the Middle East and water issues and so forth. But it didn't work. When Bill Clinton became president, partly because he was of a different party, partly because he was of a different generation, partly because he understood that what Bush did wasn't working. So his way of framing the issues was to try and invigorate the UN system. It had been conceived in the mid-1940s. It was going to lead the Security Council at the United Nations and all of the subsidiary agencies as the primary problem manager, stability manager, conflict avoidance manager for the world. And that was disrupted because of the Cold War, the exercise of veto power by the Russians, by the United States at different times. He gave a shot at see if we can make this work, the vision of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt generation of people. It didn't work either. The most concrete manifestation of that was the use of UN peacekeeping forces. There were more UN peacekeeping operations during the 8 years of the Clinton administration than the entire rest of the history of the United Nations.
Wow.
Good idea, but it didn't carry over into lots of other issues: nuclear proliferation, climate change, trade, global finance, that the interests were too much in conflict, or the road ahead was not sufficiently clear to anybody. Kind of take responsibility for building a new system. George W. Bush had a different vision. It was to be one that recognized economic competition as a major driver. So manage the economic competition and you'd manage the strategic rivalry in it. Whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, it was almost immediately overtaken by the events of 9/11, and his entire administration became one of countering international terrorism. Obama gave it another shot, recognizing that the American public was losing confidence in, patience with the role of the United States in the post-World War II realm, where basically the United States maintained the stability of the international system. We were the global sheriff. We had a plethora of bilateral and multilateral alliances in which we provided security to our partners, and they thanked us for that. We opened our markets, our economy, our society, our education institutions to our partners, and they took advantage of that. It was not a stupid system, strategy. My view was very, very prudent, because assuming the burdens of security provider, using the nuclear deterrent capability that we have, it made the decades after World War II the most peaceful in hundreds of years. And that peace and stability enabled, again, absolutely unprecedented economic growth, increases in prosperity. Using our economic might, the strength of our education systems, our financial systems, to help our partners, our allies, to become stronger and more prosperous. Not entirely altruistic. The logic was rich partners buy more stuff than poor partners. And more to the point, prosperous partners and allies buy the stuff that we manufacture as a comparative advantage. So it was creating things that made the United States as prosperous as we are today. When Obama took office, he took up a charge that Bush had had to abandon because of terrorism, which was retreating from the overextension of the United States in Afghanistan, in Iraq, commitments that were questionable at best in many parts of the world, a period of retrenchment. We'd had them before. We retrenched immediately after World War II. We retrenched during the Nixon administration after Vietnam. We had to rebuild the military. We had to rebuild portions of the civilian economy. What Obama tried to do was operate with burden sharing, shared partnerships that European allies, our Asian allies, and particularly South Korea and Japan, that they take up more of the responsibility for both security, the Nixon doctrine, which still is, in many ways, it's a part of a Trump doctrine if he put one together, where we rely on our partners in the region to have first responsibility for maintaining stability, with us in a backup position. Offshore balancing is the jargon that was used. Somebody in his administration used the rather unfelicitous terminology of characterizing it as leading from behind, which looked to many like abandonment of traditional policies, abandonment of the global strategy that we'd followed since the 1940s. When Mr. Trump became president the first time, he didn't have a strategy. The America First strategy, it was transactional. was minimized, was complete retrenchment, back away even more, but doing it in a way that disparaged and undermined the partnerships and alliances. It's to close out this introductory. When Biden took office, he concentrated on rebuilding the liberal international order, rebuilding the alliances, rebuilding the economic partnerships. The difference was he did not rebuild the free trade pillar of the post-World War II system. That Trump had continued a decoupling of the United States, a backing away of trade that had actually begun a decade earlier, because the global trading system, the World Trade Organization, wasn't working. U.S. had attempted leadership for more than 15 years. The Doha round, it was called, and couldn't get where we wanted to be. So there was a backing away from it. Trump backed away even more. Biden didn't push to restore that. It was restored. We're going to run the world together with our friends and partners. We're going to tackle international issues by working with the people who share values with we do. Not necessarily because they were the most important players in the world, but because it was easy to persuade them. And they could persuade us to join in a collective effort to tackle problems. That's the run-up for the article that John Eikenberry put together. I'm not going to march through his essay, although I think it's pretty good. It's highly academic. Under my professor hat, I'd be delighted to write that chapter. Under my former official hat, it's interesting, it's not useful. So I'll stray between my pedantry as a scholar and my experience as an official. That what I'm going to do this evening is to continue framing the topic by focusing on the issues, identify some of the key challenges, some of the policy choices that we need to make, can make as a nation, choices that we may be making by default. Not making a decision is a decision. And not coming up with a strategy to manage problems is, in effect, a strategy. It's one that's probably doomed to fail. But that's building up to the, where are we today? And I do intend to get there before we run out of time. And let me start having described the history through several administrations of a look for another strategy, a grand strategy in the academic jargon. The grand strategy of the Cold War was called containment. We hold our allies and our partners close, we give them all kinds of special privilege, and we hold our adversary at arm's length. Friends got everything, adversaries got nothing. One concrete illustration, over the period from World War II until the demise of the Soviet Union, we had an academic exchange agreement with Moscow. Over that entire period, the number of scholars who actually were, was in the dozens. And it was rigid. If a physicist wanted to come to the United States, the Soviets had to admit an American physicist in the Soviet Union. Same for poets, same for historians. And it didn't happen. And the isolation, it was an important part of the containment strategy. the US system is hard to manage because it's entirely, almost entirely decentralized, partly the constitutional order. Enumerated policies to the federal government, those not enumerated are reserved to the states. Those responsibilities and powers not exercised by the states are reserved to the people. Washington has a very limited repertoire to manage foreign policy. It actually doesn't have very many people to manage foreign policy. One indicator of it is the number of foreign service officers. State Department employees deployed about, I think it's 235 diplomatic posts around the world. There are fewer foreign service officers than there are members of US military bands. Or another comparison, there are more lawyers in the Pentagon than there are diplomats in Washington and around the world. Before somebody leaves, so that's outrageous. It's important to understand how our system works. That the grand strategy, the what are we trying to do idea that Eikenberry says we need a new one. And that most people would say, yes, we do. Because if you can't explain on a 3x5 card or a bumper sticker or a trailer under a news item, what it is we're trying to do, it's very hard to build support. The military calls this commander's intent. What is it we're trying to do? And then leaves it to the operators, the implementers, to figure out how to do it. The goal is clear, the means for getting it are not, and the agents for executing American foreign policy are mostly not government officials. They're state officials, they're academic organizations, they're professional societies, they're corporate operators, multinational businesses. And that's the way it works by design and by happenstance. And it's worked pretty well. So a big complication to we got to have a new grand strategy. Tacitly, you have to have buy-in from the American Nurses Association, from the Organization of State Attorneys General, groups of universities, the National Science Academies.
Okay, got it.
Everybody's got a stake, therefore everybody has an interest in doing it. Without having a strategy, it's hard to pull in the same direction. So you get something less than chaos, but you're not on the same page, maybe in the same book, but not on the same page. So looking for a way to bring it all together is hard. It's hard for political reasons. It's also hard because the world is a messy place and it won't stand still. That about the time you think you have a pretty good concept here, things change. Serendipity is probably the most important determinant of what the United States does around the world. Because we respond and try to respond and are pressed by our citizens to respond to things all over the world that most countries don't pay attention to or don't have to pay attention. And among the explanations for that are polyglot population. We've got hundreds of thousands or millions of American citizens who operate in our political system, and they themselves or their parents or their grandparents came from every country on the planet. So what happens in Malawi or Bolivia matters to a segment of our population that calls up a member of Congress and who calls up somebody in the State Department and said, what are you going to do about this? And kind of we feel compelled to at least look into it. And the American belief we can fix anything. Give it a shot on it. And sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. The logic of the post-World War II system that for now almost a decade has been under assault, political assault, opinion writers, slice of the academic community as having been misguided and a failure. That it was misguided because it made China a peer competitor. It was misguided because it allowed other countries to exploit, take advantage of the United States. And what did we get out of it? Well, we got a lot out of it. That part of the narrative is missing in the common characterization of it. Dramatically so in the MAGA version of the state of the United States and its relationship with the world now. That there's a couple of indications. The strategy worked pretty well. The longest period of peace in modern history, particularly in East Asia. The tremendous economic growth, the reduction in the number of people living in abject poverty, the integration of the world, technologically, commercially, intellectually, in my lifetime, the lifetime of most people in this room, is incredible. And it didn't just happen. It happened because of things the United States did and didn't do. That system, that strategy, the system which has the name, the liberal international order, where liberal in this context means tolerant, a loose guidance, not the Roman Empire controlling every aspect of every, or the Soviet Empire controlling things. The idea was to have a low barrier to joining. People would want to be in this because it makes you richer and it provides protection. So low cost of admission, high cost of exiting. Not just somebody going to force them to stay in, but you leave, you give up the privileged access, the privileged security, not just with the United States, but with everybody else that is in the club to it. So it built a system that is remarkable, putting on my academic hat, in world history, because the leading power, the hegemonic power, which is us, willingly allowed ourselves to be constrained within the system that we built. Think of this as Gulliver laying down and telling the Lilliputians, put the strings over me. Restrict what I can do in this. That it was remarkable. We accept it most of the time. Or we accept it unless it's inconvenient. It was inconvenient to accept the constraints on the Bush administration that would have prevented us overthrowing Saddam Hussein. So we ignored it. There are plenty of other examples where we didn't play by the rules that we established. The really important point I want to make here, we benefited enormously. The institutions that were built and tweaked, built by us, tweaked collectively by all of the beneficiaries of this system, changed the world, and it made many of those institutions out of date. They contain within them the seeds of their own decreasing efficacy and increasing irrelevance. That they were great in preventing another Great Depression of the 30s. They were great for preventing another world war under the conditions that existed in the 1930s. They're not so great for the second, now the third decade of the 21st century. So they need to be changed. Probably nobody recognizes the need for change more than Americans who worry about these issues. Because of our leadership role, we can see the problems. The majority of the world just joined the club. Until the end of the Cold War, until roughly 1992, most countries in the world had a post-colonial system that was more like Stalin's approach to development than like democratic capitalism. It was a sort of socialist. There's one party dominated, and it seemed like a good idea at the time they adopted it. It wasn't the system of the colonial power that had just freed them. But the demise of the Soviet Union said it didn't work. And China, which had abandoned that system in the late 70s, joined the liberal international order, had done very much better. So now dozens and dozens of countries, what used to be known as the Group of 77, or the non-aligned countries, or the Global South, most of them now want to imitate what China did. They don't want to be China, but they want to imitate that path to development. So in days when I was still an official, they'd go to them and talk and say, what are your ideas on remaking the system? Don't mess with the system. We just figured it out. We just got in. We just began training people to operate in that system. Don't mess with it. That was a constraint on a positive approach to building a new strategy. Now, the narrative that is articulated in a campaign by the new administration that has the United States having been victimized and being in terrible shape, and that we ought to, as we come to this crossroads and build new institutions and approach the rest of the world, the starting point articulated is we've been screwed and we won't take it anymore. It's a nonsensical narrative. That it's one of these unfortunate for the people who articulate it, where facts get in the way. And that at the end of the Cold War, the United States accounted for roughly 26% of the world economy. Today, we account for 26% of the world economy. The difference is that 30 years ago, we were up almost 7% of global population. Now we're 4.5%. On a per capita basis, we're a bigger economic player than we were in this. That 16 years ago, at the time of the global financial crisis, it started here, Made in America crisis, the US and the European economies were just about the same size. They had 100 million more people than we did, but the economies were about the same size. 16 years later, the US economy is twice the size of Europe's. In the mid-90s, some of you remember when Japan was number one and Japan was going to displace us in the international system. Japan's per capita wealth was 50% greater than that of Americans. Today, American wealth is 140%. of Japan's. There are lots of indicators one can point to, but Japan is a wealthy country, very capable country, highly democratic country. If Japan were a state in the United States, it would rank just below Mississippi as the poorest state in the Union. And Japan and the UK and Germany and France are all in that same. They're all poorer than our poorer state. They're great places to be, but per capita income and total expenditures, they're not in the same league. One more. India now is displaced China as the largest population, but also the fastest growing major economy. And India has just displaced California as the 5th largest economy in the world. We do it with 40 million. They do it with 1.4 billion. I mean, if you look at the concrete stuff as opposed to rhetoric, we're not doing so badly. So as we think about what role should our country play in the world, can we afford to provide 40% of the humanitarian aid to the entire world, which is what USAID did until it was cut off 10 days ago? The answer is yes. But the confusion about what's the status of our country, that the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations does polls every couple of years. They always ask, one of the questions is ask the American people, public, how much aid do we provide to the world? The answer is always around 20% of our government expenditure going as foreign aid. And you ask, how much should we provide to the world? Oh, probably less than 10%. Okay, that's still a lot of money. The actual figure is less than 1% is what we put into foreign aid. And among the reasons that we hold it to that figure is we can't push any more than that through the pipeline. The recipients can't handle it. It takes a lot of administrative talent to handle food and health and education programs. And aid doesn't even count remittances. Immigrants who send money home. It dwarfs our foreign aid package. And it goes to people. It doesn't go to governments. It doesn't get stolen along the way. It's very effective. So the question isn't how does the United States recover its rightful place atop the world system? We're at the top of the world system. Is do we want to be the only guy up there? Is this king of the hill? I'm here and I'm going to do everything I can to keep you from coming up here. Or can I give you a hand to get up here because you'll help with some of the burdens and responsibilities of management? I say these calls for a grand strategy are not new, but figuring out what it should be is not easy. The multi-year debate about whether to stick with the once great containment strategy, the post-World War II process, even though it's not working, or switch to something that is risky because we don't know, it's unproven, that we've backed into continuing it. The new jargon is return to great power competition. This phrase has been around for almost a decade now. Is that it's pretty vague. Is the great power China, United States? Is the United States Russia, the European Union, Brazil, India, China, who's the great power that are in this competition? De facto, it's drifted towards cross out Soviet Union, right in China. Take the policies. God, they were successful over so many years, and we'll keep working with. The problem is they were running out of gas long before the Soviet Union imploded, and they're not remotely appropriated to the world of today, let alone tomorrow. And the Eikenberry approach, excellent scholarly approach to identify the challenges and to come up with ways to manage them. He frames them in terms of 3 crises, 3 worlds, and 3 possible grand strategies. It's neat. Let me run through the crises because they are important as capturing in a few words kind of the nature of the world here. That when he calls the geopolitical crisis, the breakdown of the international order, for him, that's kind of personal. He's written the defining books on the liberal international order and the American role in it. So there is what I have staked my career on here is falling apart. And it demonstrably is. And there are lots of manifestations of this, including the democratic backsliding. The countries like Hungary, that have gone from a vibrant new democracy into something pretty authoritarian. Regimes that are becoming much less liberal, whether on identity basis or nationality or religious grounds, that fly in the face of what's made the system work. But that crisis number 1, you can't keep doing what we've been doing because it doesn't work anymore. And you'll make it worse if you try to prolong the life of that system. The second is, again, the slogan, return of great power politics. This one, the terminology is out there, but it pretty quickly falls apart. It means, who are the great powers? That Eikenberry, as well, the US-led West, US, Europe, the democracies of East Asia, most of the economic power in the world, most of the military power in the world. That's the liberal order. So who's in the other side, the illiberal, the autocratic rival? Well, that's Russia, that's China, and you go, what else? Well, Iran. Okay. Who else? North Korea. People like me go, give me a break. What's North Korea bring to the table? This is a friend nobody wants. Right? And you say, but who's and who's attracted to this model? And who would be the allies, the partners, the work to solve problems in this? It's not a crazy idea because it's a widespread idea, but it's hard to figure out what the substance would be. Crisis of modernity. This is technology, transport, dependence on hydrocarbons, its impact on the environment and on climate, that congestion in cities, that there are lots of downsides to the tremendous improvements in prosperity that we have achieved here. And one clear example is Los Angeles. Los Angeles, a big city. The city and county of Los Angeles, if it were a state, is the 10th largest state in the United States. It ran out of kind of safe places to build houses. And it started creeping up the hills and the canyons. And would anybody say, That's not a good idea. You know what happens when it rains? When it rains, you get mudslides and they end up in the ocean. And if it doesn't rain, you get fires and then you got a problem. So you could see it coming, but we didn't deal with it adequately. And you take that example and multiply it over and over, and you put it around the globe. Lots and lots of migration to urban areas, looking for jobs of people that aren't needed on the farms anymore. So they go to the cities. Where do a lot of them settle? Some of them get jobs and they work through the New York City version of they live in a slum, they work in a sweatshop, then they become cab drivers, and then they get a 7-Eleven, and then their kids are lawyers and doctors and they move out. So that happens in other countries too. But you've got large numbers of people, millions of people living in parts of cities where they shouldn't be living. They're living in the floodplain. So you get a bad storm and you flood them out. Rich people live on the hill. Poor people live down the bottom. Poor people don't have any political clout. And so these things are quite obvious. But also, what do you do about it? How do you tackle that problem? The crisis of liberal democracy. Again, many manifestations. The loss of faith in our own system here. Judgments made that democracy is too slow. You can't compete with these rivals who have imputed greater capability. China is the number one. They're going to wipe us out. They're going to beat us at everything. If you know anything about China, you say, not likely. Not likely. But we act in ways that said, if democracy is so slow, let's have authoritarian efficiency. Let's have technocrats do this. Get rid of the bureaucrats that just want to slow it down because they want to say things like, you don't want to build it there. It'll burn down in a fire. So you get rid of the zoning regulations. You can get housing faster. That's not completely illogical. It's just incredibly stupid. That framing the rivalry. Who are the rivals? If we're in a new era, is it just us and the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans or something else? In Eikenberry's scheme, he's got the US-led West. He's got the East led by Russia and China, and the global South led by India and Brazil. And just every time I see references to groupings like that, I'm reminded of watching Sesame Street with my kids 50 years ago. And which one is completely different? What doesn't fit here? And putting most of the countries in the world in the same box doesn't give them common interests, common values, common perception, the ability to work together in ways that will solve problems or challenge the leadership of the West. Eikenberry structures 3 alternative strategies for dealing with this. I think you can figure out where they're going. One is revitalize the liberal international order. It really worked well, but it needs to be updated. The Bretton Woods arrangements that manage international finance have been very successful. But what they manage now is a tiny percentage of daily international financial transactions. Most stuff isn't covered by any of those agreements. The money that moves around in derivatives and crypto currencies, in the various swaps and trading them, and it moves so fast, completely unregulated. Most of it's not regulated even domestically in most countries, including ours. And it's sort of waiting for somebody to impose some rules and order to it. But who's going to lead it? When the world got remade after World War II, most countries were flat on their back, or they were in the last stages of colonialism, working towards independence, ending poverty, alleviating poverty, and so forth. The Americans had ideas. It's an interesting history, the evolution of them. But structurally, how do we get our way? Basically, we went to the Brits and said, we want to do this. And they said, will you pay for it? We said, yeah, we'll pay for it. They said, go ahead. That was about it. Today, there are 140 more countries than there were in 1945. The 60 some odd in 1945. And we have an ethos of democratic participation. If we're going to remake the global order and it's going to affect you and your future and your kids and your firms, you want to have a say. Then you get the United Nations, the General Assembly, a cacophony of people who want to have a voice but don't have any ideas and don't have any money to pay for it or don't have any wherewithal to build it. So we didn't figure out, is it the G7 democracies? Is it the G20 largest economies? Is it some other informal grouping forged around opposition to nuclear weapons or managing the effects of climate change? That you can imagine who's in, who's out, who leads it, and who pays for it along the way. And that's where we're stuck. That's where we're stuck. So let me take this in a going beyond IR theory into the stuff happens. A lot of what becomes described as theory or grand policy packages and approaches comes after the fact. This guy sitting in a university saying, what happened? How do I explain what happened? How do I explain this in a way that is simple enough to teach, clear enough to go in an article? And it looks more purposive and ordered than it actually is. That reality, as it keeps intruding on great theory. The military expression is the first casualty of war is planning. Lots and lots of plans, lots of strategy. It falls apart with the first bullet. Trying to remake the world falls apart with the first. A few weeks ago, I gave a talk to a World Affairs Council down in Monterey on challenges to foreign policy before the inauguration of the new administration. And much of that I focused on my experience, having gone through several transitions. And as a very senior official in a transition from Clinton to Bush, and then Bush to Obama, that the stuff happens. I mean, what had happened since the election that challenged American foreign policy? Gaza. I know Gaza started a year earlier with the attacks, but the possibility of a ceasefire, the extent of the destruction, the humanitarian, all of this had become a political issue in the United States after the election. Ukraine, started in 2022. Trump promised he'd solve it even before he was inaugurated. But people taking actions, Europeans pumping up the amount of weaponry that is in there, the US shipping stuff in expectation that it's going to stop or be cut back. But how do you do it? How can you work the Sudan? the civil war in Sudan between two factions of the military. It doesn't very often make it into our news broadcasts or our news media more broadly. But there are more dead in Sudan than in Ukraine. And the number of displaced people in Sudan, it's 25 million. That's bigger than most countries. The population is displaced, hungry, nothing to do except run to the next perceived safe space. The removal of the South Korean president. Okay, it's a pretty important ally of the United States. One of Biden's really signature accomplishment is getting the Japanese and the Koreans to work together so we could have a triangular relationship instead of two bilateral ones. And now both of Biden's partners are gone. The Japanese was voted out and the Korean was impeached, and now Biden's out. So what was to be a major pillar of a new system in Asia looks pretty problematic in there. Then the tariffs, the use of the threat of tariffs to extract concessions of one kind or another drives the US further away from the trade integration. The logic that if people are economically interdependent, they will have disincentives to fighting with one another. If their own prosperity, and this is a logic that was the coal and iron community in Europe, that was the basis for the economic community, European economic, that was the basis for the EU within there. And it worked as a model that were there. So what do we do? And I'll close with this. Eikenberry's kind of suggestion is a combination. That we have a combination of working with partners who agree with us and will work with us, but not having unbridled competition and rivalry with the others. You work with them too, where you can, on preventing explosive growth of nuclear weapons, of combating the effects of climate change, managing pandemic disease, managing water, water shortages in many, many parts of the world. And water shortages aren't abstract because you can't grow food without water, and people can't live without water. And the water energy interaction. Basically, you can't do energy without water on it. So how do we do that? How do we put together a problem by problem approach? Say, let's put together a team of anybody that's willing to work on that problem, and just work on it and treat it as a separate issue. You want to work on nuclear weapons. Okay, the next round of nuclear weapons, you got to get the Chinese into the equation. The US and the Russians, which have done this since the Cuban Missile Crisis, reduced the number dramatically, and reduced uncertainty about it by explaining, on Tuesdays, we do maintenance on this missile field. When we open up the silos, we're not getting ready to launch on you, and they do the same kind of thing. Having co-chaired the unofficial talks since we cut off direct talks after 2014, the Russians made very clear they can't go any lower on number of warheads unless the Chinese are in. Because their calculus is, they got to deal with the Americans, but they also got to deal with the Chinese. And the Americans say, well, yeah, we got the same problem. So how do you get the Chinese in? And can't get the Chinese in without the British and the French. And what about the Indians and the Pakistanis? And suddenly you're into this too many people, too many permutations. But can you do that separate from working on reducing hydrocarbons or combating disease or other things? I hope so. But we don't have a lot of reason for optimism. And I'll end with this, and it's because, not because they're inherently insuperable problems. It's because we seem to have an administration that doesn't want to solve these problems, that wants to bully other countries into doing things that America wants that will benefit only America, or America more than somebody else, or make up for exploitation in the past. I think what we're going to need pretty quick is a strategy that says, how do we operate in a world where most everybody else is going to try and work around us? They'll work together because they can. They'll work within limits that imposes, and we'll be on the outside looking in. That's not a good place to be, but it is a good place to stop. So I will do that. I'll stop here, open it up to questions. I'll take questions in here, and Lou will take questions and relay them to me from those who are online. And yes, I saw your hand first, and we'll bring you a microphone so that the Zoomers can hear as well.
Thank you. How is this proposal to bring back great power competition? Is that the same as or different from the Russian proposal for the new multipolar world and Russia 2.0 and all that? Thank you.
Yeah, the question, in case people didn't hear it, how does a multipolar world differ from the Russian, the great power competition model? How exactly do they differ? That the Russian version, which I can very push out, this is the autocrat version, the China, Russia, others. Envision a world with spheres of influence. 150 years ago, our invocation of the Monroe Doctrine. We take care of any problems in the Western Hemisphere. Now, at the time that the doctrine was playing, we had no capacity whatsoever. The British thought it was a good idea to keep the French and the Spaniards and others out. So it was their Navy that made our policy effective. But spheres of influence that basically says you stay out of the space that's the former Soviet Union. The Chinese, you stay out of the South China Sea and more broadly into Southeast Asia. And that Brazil would get a bigger role in Latin America, that the liberal international order that we've had, it aims to be global, universal, anybody, everywhere, and no spheres of influence. Ours comes out of anti-colonialism, the American opposition to colonialism. That's because of our own experience. We were the first new nation. And one of the things that the brand new United States experienced was imperial countries, starting with Britain, wouldn't let us into their empires. The imperialists standing together, even the French, our allies. And so we went around looking where we could find blank spaces that weren't occupied. And from the 18th century, American opposition to colonialism was colonies are closed to American trade. They're closed to people, American missionary activity initially. Now it's human rights, it's health, it's education, it's a whole range of things. So the liberal order was designed to open up everything to everybody on an assumption of fair competition. We win because we got more of everything than anybody else does. So we win. So it was entirely selfless. The alternative model is to divide the world into pieces. And multipolar isn't 193 equal players on the globe. It's great powers and their satellites or their dependencies. And as this version of the superpower rivalry plays out, most countries are in the don't want to be forced to choose, but they also don't want to have too great a harmony between the great powers. If the United States and China, the United States or Russia, we solved all problems, there's no room for the little guys. They can't maneuver between us to try and extract benefits. Hey, if you don't loan me a lot of money at a low rate, I'm going to go to the other guys and let them build the steel mill or whatever it is. I'll buy my airplanes from them. That's the basic difference. So it runs up against American history. It runs up against where we think we have a comparative advantage in operating around the globe.
So great power competition is economic?
It's economic. There's not much of a great power competition is economic. Primarily it is. There's not much of an ideological component as there was in the Cold War. Communism versus democracy, going for the hearts and minds, going to build in Eichenberry's analysis, in my analysis, that the Chinese, the Russians, they're not looking to convert other countries to adopt their political system, their ideology. They don't care. They just want them not aligned with us in there and open to their preferred way of doing business.
Tom, we have a question from online.
Go ahead.
Let me find it. It's from Marcia. Marcia, let me pull up your question. Assuming the current administration is successful in its campaign to shrink government agencies significantly, assuming the administration is successful, how hard will it be to rebuild our foreign policy capabilities in a future administration?
The question is, assuming that the administration is successful in severely reducing the U.S. foreign policy institutions, professional staff, and so forth, how hard would it be to rebuild? I think it's going to be very hard. That it's easy to break stuff. The world or institutions, they're a lot like Humpty Dumpty. It goes off the wall. It's hard to put it back together. But the to me, incredibly misguided attacks on the professionals that staff the institutions of the government, including the foreign affairs institutions, State Department, USAID, the really dumb one from yesterday, the National Nuclear Safety Administration. These are guys that do our stockpile safely, nuclear weapons. That people leave, they're not going to want to come back. If they're out for a couple of years, they've lost a lot of expertise. You've lost a lot of connections and networking that is in there. Something you got to build new. You've lost the institutional memory of those things that should be changed. They don't work very well. Who knows that? The insiders know that. And the clout that we have, because we have been perceived as most of the time more or less willing to identify American interests with global interests instead of being narrowly selfish. And I think in 3 weeks, we've destroyed that impression of who we are. And it's again, it's very easy to fall off a cliff. It's hard to climb back up. Even if people want to, and I'll come with one more example, because in my own career, I had a very successful career in part because of McCarthyism in the 1950s. It made China in particular and Asia more broadly a third rail. If you were interested in a career in national security, you didn't go near these topics until the mid 60s, where the training began, and there were very few teachers, there were very few materials, and it took a couple decades to rebuild this stuff. And when I was recruited out of Stanford in 1985 to go head the China division at the State Department, it was because the relationship had become big enough, broad enough, diverse enough. There weren't enough people in the government that had any China experience. There were very senior people who were missionary kids and they come there, but nobody had been trained and nobody had entered. And I'm afraid that's going to happen in lots of areas of government. I'll go right here.
Thank you very much. An amazing talk. I'm not American. I'm British.
Okay.
The perspective that struck me very much listening to you from on the other side of the pond is it looks like America ceded all of its international policy and most of its government policy to its large companies. So we see America not through your international diplomats, but through Facebook or X. And the next generation of nuclear weapons, you've allowed the private industry to build. AI is much more dangerous than nuclear weapons ever were. And the American government hasn't got a Los Alamos for AI. So your talk was fascinating, but it feels like the solutions to the next set of problems that you're talking about don't lie with tools in the past. They lie in somehow getting control of the private industry that's usurped American greatness.
Well, the question is that no, the U.S. government appears to have abdicated or outsourced the responsibility to the corporate sector, to firms. Facebook and X and others. And I agree that perception is there, that it sort of seems to validate the century-old Marxist communist. America is run by Wall Street. Once upon a time, we sort of were, but there was Wall Street to put together the liberal international order. This is not Wall Street. This is engineers or programmers. And one of the things, sort of I learned early on in the study of political science are different logics that
Excuse me, did you say different logics?
Engineering logic. You tell an engineer, build a dam. They'll build you the most beautiful dam. It'll have the most power generation capacity and the biggest lake behind it. And you say, what about the people that you're going to swamp? What about fish? What about navigation? That you need it different than the aesthetics of engineering or economics. I'll build you the most cost-effective facility that any engineer can imagine. And that's different. Again, you say, who benefits? Who's disadvantaged in there? That's a political logic of how do you compromise? How do you minimize the downside and maximize the benefit? We look like to me, like we're tilting into this. This is a technical problem that can be solved with it, and it can't, in my judgment. So the two strands I want to pick up on is not Can we get it back? I believe we can. I'm a congenital optimist. But there's both the reality and my answer to the previous question. It's hard to build institutions. It's hard to staff institutions. It's hard to get a consensus on what it is that the institution and the people are supposed to be doing. The almost entirely separate is the perception. Even if we solve all those problems, we got to overcome the world sees as something else, and we'll have to regain a lot of credibility, soft power in the jargon.
Tom, we have a question here from the folks in Zoom.
Go ahead, Lou.
This is from Robert. Capsule review of the last 80 years. Let's say there are two phases from 1945 to 1991, and again from 1992 to present. Much of the good things that you described that came out of the post-war liberal consensus came after 1991. So Tom, what is your reaction to that response of the review?
What's my reaction to the idea of dividing the post-Cold War period at 1991 or 1992 and seeing the good things coming out of the containment, the American grand strategy coming after? I don't think so. I think the core logic of containment as articulated by George Kennan was that the Soviet Union contains the seeds of its own destruction. It can't succeed. So let it implode. Help it to implode by denying them access to the things that would bolster their economy, their military, their education, their healthcare system. Let them implode. It turns out that the Soviet system was more capable than that assumed. It lasted longer. It developed some, very problematic things in space and nuclear weapons. For example, it did very poorly in commercial products coming out of science research. But the failure of the UN system because of the Cold War, the Cold War had the effect of having it put in place at a much smaller scale. The West, the transatlantic relationship, bringing Japan into the Western world, which was not a foregone conclusion. That the American policy at the end of World War II was to keep Japan agrarian, not industrialized, never have, and the Korean War flipped us on that. We did not want a neutral and even worse, a Japan that might align with the Soviet Union. So we developed Japan, and that worked out. So maintaining peace, facilitating economic development, the tremendous technological gains that came because of pumping government money into scientific research, into health research. And a lot of this was done under Cold War. I can remember being in high school and the Soviet Union trained, I don't know, some multiple the number of physicians that we did every year. And this was a part of the race to be ahead in everything on it. Nobody asked, are these doctors any good? That it wasn't, you don't measure doctors by the pound. You measure it in something else. So a lot of what I don't like about attitude now is we're doing the same thing, only you put China in the equation in it. And I've said in other contexts, this return of great power is intellectually lazy and it's politically constipated. That we do lots of things in this country as a result of the way in which we pursued the Cold War rivalry. One consequence of that is we use the defense, the national security budgets, as the principal redistributive mechanism in our country. It's how New York pays for schools in Arkansas, how Massachusetts pays for hospitals in Mississippi. And yeah, we're all one country, and I have absolutely no problem with it. I do have a problem with hiding it in the defense budget. So that to change to something that said we're no longer in a Cold War model, where defense, and particularly dealing with a designated bad guy, China, determines every derivative policy, how much you can spend on preschool education, how much you can spend on child nutrition, or whatever it is. It's what's left over after you've dealt with this existential threat problem. We don't have an existential threat now. We ought to continue to do a lot of those things that we've been doing for decades, but we ought to admit that we're doing it. And one of the perverse things that might come out of this Trump-Musk go added, there is a lot of inefficiency in our system, but it's inefficiencies that were built deliberately to integrate the country, to redistribute wealth, to improve the health of people who might move from point A to point B to take a new job. That it's not all crazy, but it's lazy. And it said, well, we should change the name. And then we can continue doing what we have been doing for decades. And what we've been doing for decades is among the reasons that half of our population supported at least the theory of knock it all down and start again. That I guess I've said enough on that. Let me go here because I'm trying to in the order in which I saw people.
Thanks, Tom. Really,
Thank you.
incredibly interesting and wide-ranging, ambitious talk. Much appreciated. I know you're a real China expert, so I'd like to sneak in 2 China-related questions, and
Okay.
you can take one or both of them if you'd like. They're kind of separate, but if I understood correctly, when you were in the first part of your talk, when you seemed to think that the World Trade Organization is one of the institutions of the liberal international order that really is no longer fit for purpose. To what extent was China's behavior within the WTO responsible for that? I mean, a lot of people brought them in and then they didn't play by the rules. So that's one. The other question in a little different direction is any thoughts on the durability, long-term prospects of the China-Russia alliance? How solid do you think it is, and how should we, the United States, be looking at that adversarial partnership?
I'll take both of them very quickly. On the World Trade Organization, I'll be brief because the speaker next week, Michael Beaman, has just published a terrific book called Walking Out. It's U.S. policy walking away from the trade institutions and policies that we presume. He's a deputy USTR. So this is insider knowledge over many administrations. So the United States thought there were problems with the global trading system that we built long before Trump and long before China actually got in. China is, the 10th nail in the coffin, but as it expanded to include lots and lots of developing countries, primarily India is, I think, culpable here, that to protect their agricultural industries and a broader sense to protect their service industries, blocked expansion of free trading stuff to the areas where we had a comparative advantage. So we weren't getting out of this what we wanted to get out of it. And others had similar problems. So we'd begun to move early 90s, the NAFTA agreement, into can't get it on a global scale, get it in a regional basis where you can harmonize and make it. And the US was the key player. We have parallel talks going on in Asia, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and with Europe. The devil was the acronym. I can't remember, but it's basically the same thing. The US is the hinge. US didn't care fundamentally whether we got agreement with Asia first or with Europe first, because we weren't going to agree to anything that would be different in our two, 40% of our trade this way, 40% of our trade that way. They had to be compatible. So this was a strategy that would get the bulk of world trade under from our perspective, a better framework without the nuisance of having to bring along the little guys, the obstructionist. And that played out, I think we handled it very badly. China coming in strengthened the political argument that it's a problem, but that wasn't the real, they had a different set of problems. China, Russia, I actually don't worry about it very much. This is an unnatural grouping that I think the Chinese have buyer's remorse. That the Chinese became much more fearful of us 2009, 10, in there after the global financial crisis. Their own economy plateaued. They're beginning to have problems. They're quite visible now. We could see them outside. They surely could see them inside. They foresaw China overtaking the United States. They're going to pass us as the biggest economy in the world, and more technologically advanced. This power shift was the jargon out there. It turned out to be completely fanciful, but they saw that as making us more dangerous. I think they mirror imaged. If we were king of the hill and they were coming up, we're not going to let them get there. We would do everything we could to stop them from displacing us, including using all of our economic leverage, our technology leverage, our people-to-people penetration of their system, and even military. And they debated, are our nuclear weapons enough to keep the Americans at bay? Maybe not. Let's go back to Kissingerian strategic triangle stuff. Make the Americans think twice that the Russians might have our back. Then they went into Ukraine. And the Chinese being in the same group with North Korea, this is not a happy day for them, as they're more worried about the North Koreans than we are. So this one is going to fall apart unless, through stupidity on our side, we make real something we don't want to happen. Thanks, Scott. Lou, do you have another one?
Yes, we do, and it has to do with Ukraine. What is your view of the near-term situation with Ukraine and how the war can be resolved?
I don't know how the war can be resolved. I wish I did. I wish somebody did. But getting Crimea back, I think that's probably a bridge too far. How much of the land that's been occupied since February of 2022, I don't know. That it's baffling to me that the Russians have done as badly as they have. They get a lot more people, they had a lot more armaments. It takes time to learn, the Western armament that has been poured in, lots and lots of it. It's completely different than what the Ukrainian forces had trained on, and the tactics to use it and so forth. So they're learning on the fly. And I think morale is going to be a big factor, that they're fighting for survival of the homeland. I think it's going to look a whole lot different if they think we're not behind, we, the United States, are not behind them. And that if we're not behind them, the Europeans won't be behind them. I think morale could crumble. A civilian population, and the Russians get a victory they do not deserve. Let me go right here, I guess. And then in the back, I'll give.
How does the world today look at the Washington Consensus?
How does the world today look at the Washington Consensus? The Washington Consensus, the Washington refers to the World Bank, not to the American government in Washington. World Bank is headquartered in Washington. And after the demise of the Soviet Union, it was interpreted as proving the validity of an approach that said the way to prosperity and stability, free markets, participation in the global economic rules-based order, and democracy. And that you needed both. That was the consensus inside the development bank, not the American government on it. I think the narrative about foolish character, counterproductive character of American policy since World War II that I touched on briefly at the moment, has undermined confidence. And the Chinese example that they got a lot of development without democracy, without electoral democracy, without liberal democracy, but not without a government being responsive to the demands, the needs, the concerns of the population. That's an aspect of governance that, do you have the consent of the governed? Partially coerced, maybe for some like the Uyghurs, Tibetans, heavily coerced, but it was delivering. So democracy as a system that delivers, that's where I think the developmental notion of the consensus originated, but with the democratic wave that swept the world after the demise of the Soviet Union, and we went from whatever the number was to twice that with democratic countries. And now there's been a pretty significant reduction in the number of countries, as well as the classification or how democratic. I mean, one of the appalling things is in the Freedom House, which is one of the think tanks that pretends to track and measure this, and in the absence of anybody else, that's what it is. We have fallen significantly on their measures of democracy over the last 10 years.
So it's a rejection of the democratic leg of the Washington.
It's a yes, and the little more of it is that the rules-based economy, rules-based international system that China, Russia, and a significant chunk of the global South says, yeah, they're your rules. You wrote the rules, you rigged them so that you benefit more than anybody else, which much jaded was sort of, well, yeah, if you made the rules, you do the same thing. but we're not excessive. It's not only for America and screw everybody else that compared to alternatives. It's that, but there is a lack of the support for rules-based, but not the existing rules. And you say, what's a better rule? And the answer to that is, we want a seat at the table. So, okay, what are you going to propose as a better rules-based system? We're thinking about that. We're working on that. And unfortunately, that's where we are. Nobody's come up with something better. Say, I don't like it anymore, and it's broken, but there's no replacement. Yes, in the back.
So I've learned a lot of things from your talk, but I don't trust that Trump is gonna learn a lot of things from the facts. He's dismantling all of the systems and all these systems that you've talked about that are falling apart. So I guess I'd like to understand what power he actually has to accomplish anything in the international arena. Like he says he's gonna solve the Ukraine thing, and he's gonna solve the Gaza thing, and he's gonna do this, and he's gonna do that. And a lot of his ego is tied up in being the whatever person who finally fixes whatever it is the problem is. But without, you know, the carrot of participating in the US and without the stick, like, so what is his actual source of power to get something done in this new, there is no government world?
Yeah, that was an excellent question. The power of what is Trump's power to actually get things done in terms of changing the international system? It's a classic version of, yeah, you can't beat something with nothing. And the US has been overly ready to step forward and take the lead and fund or fix, maintain for years. The rest of the world has gotten a little bit lazy or comfortable with us doing that, or chosen to allocate its taxpayer dollars to do other things than what would give it the leverage. So there's no effective opposition, except nobody thinks what he's doing is a good idea. So I think we are driving other countries to be closer together, as I put it, around us and around us. That the real constraint, I think, on him is going to be the U.S. Congress. If Rip Van Winkle ever wakes up and accepts its responsibilities here, that it will have to be involved in actually carrying out any of these proposals. I don't see any other parts of the world ready to leap to the support of the Americans to take over the Panama Canal or Greenland or turn Gaza into the Riviera. I mean, there is a sort of, he's got one hand trying to clap, and there's nobody out there that is willing to help. So at some point, I think his desire to win, to succeed at something, will cause him to settle for something like the Canadians did, that they agreed after he twisted the arm on tariffs to do what they were doing anyway, and he chose to declare that victory on it. Point to what he'd done. I think that, in combination with, at some point, we have members of Congress say, why in the world did you get elected if you wanted to be a doormat or a jellyfish? That's, I think, where the pushback will come effectively. Pushing back on the United States, you got to be a lot of chutzpah to do that. I mean, that the list of things where we are so many multiples ahead of the rest of the world, that others are more aware of that than we are, and don't want to be the ones to step out front and challenge the Americans.
Right, but I think my question was something different, which is, he doesn't want to spend money abroad.
He doesn't wanna send troops abroad, he doesn't wanna fight other
Mhm.
people's battles. So if he's not gonna spend money and he's not gonna send troops. And. You know, so what is his source of like? How is he gonna convince anybody to do anything
Without a carrot and without a stick.
without a carrot and without a stick? I guess that's what I'm really confused.
No, and I think your question answers the question. And I'm not making fun of the question, but he doesn't have it. That if you have no carrots and you have no stick, and what you advocate is unpopular with everybody and not very popular here at home. That, you know, his,
Carrots will solve everything.
they will, but it's, he's squandering the economic, scientific, soft power, military protection, not the power to threaten in ways that, you know, like everything else, hard to get back once you've pissed it away. We have run over the allotted time. I would be delighted to keep entertaining you, but the Great Decisions program has pretty firm, 7 to 8:30, so that people know when it ends and my speakers know when it ends. I hope this has been worth your evening, certainly for those on the Zoom as well. Invite people back. Thank you, and invite you back. This will be posted on the First Church website in a day or two, right, Scott? In case you miss a future one or want to review this. But again, thank you for coming. Tell your friends if you think it's worthwhile. Next week will be an excellent follow-up to the question about WTO and economics as a key part of American policy. Thank you all.
And thank you very much, Tom. I'm stopping the recording now and stopping the Zoom. Good night, everybody.
Okay.